Welcome to the first episode of SSCI Insights, a new interview series from the Consumer Goods Forum, where we sit down with members and partners of the CGF's Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative to hear their insights on how the SSCI is working to build trust in sustainability standards worldwide. Today, I am joined by none other than the CGF's Director of Sustainability, Didier Bergeret, who oversees the SSCI alongside the Forest Positive Coalition and the Human Rights Coalition working to end forced labor. Thanks for joining me today, Didier.
Thanks a lot, Madeleine. Very happy to be here.
So it's great to have you on SSCI Insights as our very first guest. You have been working on the SSCI since its inception in 2017, and I just really want to take today as an opportunity to discuss where the SSCI has been, what it's doing today, and where it's going in the future. So how has the sustainability landscape changed since the SSCI began in 2017?
Well, the SSCI has been created to target one objective, which is to deal with the possible confusion arising from multiple schemes, certifications, and standards covering different aspects of sustainability. Point being that since its inception, we saw the rise of multiple other standards, which justifies that SSCI is needed as a benchmark that allows to navigate the landscape of multiple certifications and schemes and tells companies which ones are covering minimum expectations as set by their industry peers.
So if someone is going to certify a supplier as quote unquote a good supplier, that credibility element is really important. And so what credibility gaps are CGF member companies dealing with right now when it comes to sustainability standards?
Well, the point on certifying a supplier is the question on what are you certifying against? And so you can have multiple elements to consider, be it human rights, working conditions, environmental protection. But the question would then be, is it at product level? Is it at factory or plantation level? All of these are very relevant to any types of certifications, but there is no one size fit all. And the credibility issue starts with knowing what's the scope or the coverage of the certification. So what are you really looking at certifying? And then how this certification is effectively being provided and how the assessment or the monitoring is being led. And at this level, these are key elements that are core to any credible approach. And these are those elements that we effectively extracted and set up as a set of criteria covering both what schemes should cover in terms of issues, so be it child labor, forced labor, working hours, and how those issues should be monitored on the ground. And that's about the scheme management, as we call it, literally all the processes that are put in place by the certification itself to guarantee that it is fully well designed to assess with the thorough level required all these issues on the ground. And so this is exactly what the SSCI benchmarks, allowing for schemes to effectively showcase that they cover the right topics, the right issues for companies, and that they're also correctly structured and adequately resourced to deliver the job on the ground.
So then these deeper issues that you're talking about, the issues that the certification schemes will cover or certify against, we hear all the time about how companies are tackling these pressing supply chain issues like worker voices and living wage and deforestation. So how can the SSCI push the conversation forward on these supply chain issues and issues of sustainability?
Well, actually, the SSCI sets the bar onto what you need to have covered, what you need to have at hand so that companies know that the job is effectively being done, that the supplier considered has all the elements to prevent any issue or to guarantee a decent level of working conditions. When it comes to worker voice, for instance, the idea is not to say how it should be set up exactly, it's to define the criteria under which it should be operated, but then to leave for certifications to come up with their innovative approaches. So by essence, the SSCI doesn't prevent innovation, but rather supports it just by setting the key threshold elements that all standards should have to effectively deliver on the ground and to be able to be compared against each other. There are many issues that effectively require greater innovation because they're complicated. By essence, forced labor is a hidden issue. It's a fraudulent practice that impacts human rights, and no one will effectively make it easy for auditors to see if there is forced labor happening in any given plantation or manufacture. So that's where audits need to be well designed to look at the right elements and effectively use innovative practices, but also competent people to be able to assess those issues on the ground and identify if they are effectively to be found. And that's where a good certification and standard has to step out and effectively be recognized for having the ability to identify such issues. It's never going to be perfect because for most issues, the reason why they keep occurring is because there are people that are, let's say, better than us in terms of delivering the bad things on the ground. And that's why certifications allow to get a snapshot, which gives the fundamental elements to assess the situation and define whether or not there is a need to improve or amend certain things, or to effectively have a conversation with the supplier to define whether or not to maintain the relation. Now, overall, uh, the idea of standards and certification is really to anchor supply chain actors into a continuous improvement path. So standard certifications audits per se are just regular checkpoints, or providing those regular checkpoints to guarantee that you're not moving below certain thresholds and that you are respecting internationally agreed criteria on working hours, child labor, and the likes. And so technically, they need to be designed to identify things that may be complicated to assess, but also allow for continuous improvement for suppliers, providing them with the necessary um, elements showcasing that they deserve market access into international value chains.
So wrapping all of that up, the SSCI is obviously a really helpful tool for companies and organizations in their due diligence because they are benchmarking schemes and certifications to make sure that they are operating in an effective manner and covering all of these standards, as you were just saying. But additionally to that, what is the other reason why companies should join the SSCI? What is the value of being a part of this initiative itself?
Well, it is a complicated landscape. And that's why, I mean, members of the Consumer Goods Forum have decided to create the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, the SSCI. The reasoning is, okay, I may have my own approach to monitor my supply chain, but how can I guarantee that it's a good one? Second thing, there might be other approaches that are equally valid. How can I avoid requesting my approach to be applied onto the same suppliers that has already been audited with one certification or standards versus mine? So it's to allow for this mutual recognition of approaches. When it's good enough, it should be valid for everybody so that we can focus on other things than just auditing and monitoring. And so that's where the SSCI comes in. If you join SSCI, you don't only get the overview of what constitutes good standards, you're allowed to set the bar on where they should try to improve. You regularly improve the criteria against which they are benchmarked, but you also guarantee that all of these approaches that are operating for our member companies are effectively at the level of their expectations. And so joining SSCI allows you to get access to a great wealth of knowledge, better understand how to monitor complex value chains, guarantee that we're constantly pushing for improvement, but also adding at industry level a more thorough, robust, credible perception of what audits, certifications, and standards are used for, hence allowing for all the supply chain monitoring approaches to be better trusted.
So there's definitely an element of thought leadership and innovation that's involved in joining the SSCI, and that you're involved in those conversations and you really get to talk about what good looks like, and share best practices and be able to implement those. So that's really interesting. And the other thing that I think is interesting about being a part of the SSCI is that not only are you involved in those discussions within that coalition, but because the SSCI works with other coalitions at the CGF, like the Forest Positive Coalition and the Human Rights Coalition working to end forced labor, both of which you oversee as well, you also get that sort of collaboration and cross-coalition connection. So can you explain how the SSCI is working with those two coalitions as well, and how CGF members who are a part of either one of those coalitions or maybe both of those or all three of those coalitions are able to connect with each other?
Yeah, well, the rationale behind connecting the coalitions is that SSCI itself really acts as a fundamental tool to help and support the high aspirations of the Forest Positive Coalition and of the Human Rights Coalition working to end forced labor. Technically, Forest Positive recognize that certifications are a good tool that is necessary to achieve the ambitions of this coalition, but that it's not the only one. And certifications against deforestation have been very essential elements, but they need to guarantee that they are effectively looking at all the issues that we believe are the ones to take into account. And therefore, SSCI can potentially help on this commodity-based standards to get them to align and harmonize their approach, guaranteeing that you can choose multiple ones that are equally valid, but also that they constantly improve and add elements that are arising on the sustainability radar. So that allows me to connect with human rights. One key problem in plantations could be debt bondage. Actually, 50% of all human forced labor related issues are related to debt, meaning that people get to pay for a job, outrageous amounts, and they have to pay back for this job. And therefore, they are in a situation of debt bondage, aka forced labor. This is a practice that has been skyrocketing in labor markets over the last few years, which was largely unseen a couple of years ago. But now, since we know it's a reality, a complex one, an endemic one, standards, certifications, and schemes need to allow us to identify when this happens, to identify that workers, before they entered the job, may have been facing requests to pay for certain things that were not supposed to be paid by the worker, and therefore end up in a situation of debt bondage. And to assess that, in a plantation, for instance, one thing is to go for interviews, which then need to be designed to make sure that you ask the right question to the right people so that you can understand the situations they're in when they are not even sometimes self-identified as victims because they believed it was the right thing to do, for instance, to pay for a job. And so SSCI has this potential to effectively get all the necessary certification and schemes that can help the forest positive ambition next to the human rights ambition to be aligned and effectively adequately monitored. Again, SSCI doesn't provide the solution to fix the problem, but should be about making sure that we can identify what the problems are so that we can address them and remediate when necessary. And so that's where an approach like a common industry benchmark on manufacturing, primary production, or at-sea operations, which cover many of the type of suppliers you would find in our supply chains, really help to provide a common message to supply chains on what good looks like, but also guarantee that schemes can echo that message and relay that on the ground with the various assessments that they provide, allowing for a snapshot of the reality to be shared with companies that then can take the necessary decision on how to improve their entire global value chains.
So those three sectors that you just mentioned, that's the manufacturing and processing sector, the at-sea operations sector, which is fishing, and primary production, which is land-based agriculture and aquaculture. Those are the three sectors that the SSCI looks at. So in joining the SSCI, CGF members really have the opportunity to look at suppliers and how they operate across a really wide range of operations and different activities. And as well, I also heard that the SSCI is moving to create an environmental benchmark later this year. Is that correct?
Correct. And as you said, it's definitely right. We started with social, but we are covering most of the cases you would find in a typical member supply chain. So manufacturing, primary production, and at sea operations. These standards, these benchmarks, they're already there, they already exist. The criteria allowing to do the benchmarks actually are already developed, and most of them will be launched in the coming weeks. Environment is another type of aspects that we need to look into. And this is where it gets interesting because it's complicated. What are you willing to look into from an environmental perspective that will provide companies with the assurance that they use a sustainability standard they can trust? Well, that's going to be a real question that we invite everyone to join us to discuss, because be it looking at commodity level or maybe looking at issue level, water usage, carbon emissions, or looking at product specifications, there are multiple angles that we need to look into and make sure that we take the right ones to provide a uniform benchmark opportunity for all the standards that would like to effectively showcase that they cover the right environmental elements and that they are well designed to assess those on the ground. And so that's a new journey for us. Now that we have the social at hand, we are very excited to start working on the environmental piece. But I said it raises at this stage a lot of questions versus answer. And to be fair, that's definitely one of the most interesting parts of the discussion that SSCI allows, and that provides a great opportunity to learn, but also self-reflect on what our industry should be considering as the best environmental way forward, provided that SSCI can allow to benchmark all the existing tools that will put us on that journey in the right position. So that's why, I mean, again, I can only I say, if you really want to discuss all of this with us, please join the SSCI, because that's going to be an interesting development to take part in.
Well, it definitely sounds really interesting, and we'll definitely have you back on SSCI Insights after this process is complete to hear about those reflections and what it's been like to build a common environmental benchmark. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you so much, Didier, for coming on the show today and for shining a light on a lot of these invisible and hard to recognize problems that the SSCI works to address, and sharing your insights with us.
Many thanks, Madeleine, and many thanks to all of you.